Chapter 4, Unit 4, Storytelling. 4.1 Understand narrative as a rhetorical strategy. What is narrative doing here? Exactly, let's start with something you already know how to do. You've been telling stories your entire life, explaining to a parent why you were late, convincing a friend to see a movie, describing a moment that changed your mind about something. What you probably didn't realize is that every time you did that, you were deploying one of the most powerful rhetorical tools in the human arsenal. Narrative isn't just storytelling for its own sake. In the context of AP English Language and Composition, narrative is a rhetorical strategy, a deliberate, purposeful choice a writer makes to achieve a specific effect on a specific audience. That distinction is everything on this exam. The College Board defines narrative as the use of story or storytelling techniques to advance an argument, develop a line of reasoning, or establish a connection with an audience. Notice what that definition does not say. It doesn't say narrative is simply telling what happened. A news article can report events without using narrative rhetorically. What separates narrative as rhetoric from narrative as report is intention and effect. The writer shapes the story, what to include, where to begin, whose voice we hear, what details are lingered on, in service of a larger persuasive or expressive goal. When you're analyzing a text on the AP exam, your job is not just to spot the story, but to explain what the story is doing. The three core functions of narrative on the AP exam. Think of narrative as a Swiss Army knife in a writer's toolkit. It accomplishes at least three things simultaneously, and the exam will test whether you can identify all of them. First, narrative builds ethos. It establishes credibility and trust. When a writer shares a personal experience or tells the story of someone they know, they signal to the reader, "I have been close to this. I understand it from the inside." James Baldwin, writing about his father in Notes of a Native Son, isn't just sharing family history. He's positioning himself as someone whose understanding of race in America is earned through lived intimacy, not abstracted theory. The story becomes a credential. Second, narrative generates pathos, emotional resonance. This is the one most students recognize instinctively, but the trap on the AP exam is assuming pathos means the narrative is manipulative or weak. It isn't. Emotional identification is a legitimate and sophisticated form of persuasion. When Annie Dillard describes a single moth burning in a candle flame in Holy the Firm, she's using that image narratively to make you feel the weight of sacrifice and creative calling. The emotion isn't decoration, it's the argument itself experienced before it's explained. Third, and this is the one students most often miss, narrative can function as logos, as evidence and reasoning. A single well-chosen anecdote can do what pages of statistics cannot. It makes an abstraction concrete. If a writer is arguing that a public health policy is failing real people, one story of a specific family navigating that failure can be more logically persuasive than aggregate data, because it forces the reader to trace the causal chain from policy to consequence through a human life. This is sometimes called an illustrative anecdote, and recognizing its logical function, not just its emotional one, is a mark of a sophisticated reader. Key terminology you must know cold. The AP exam expects you to use precise language. When you encounter narrative in a passage, you should be able to identify and name specific narrative techniques and connect them to rhetorical effect. Anecdote is a brief personal story used to illustrate a point. It's the most common form of embedded narrative in nonfiction arguments. Vignette refers to a short impressionistic scene that captures a mood or moment rather than advancing a plot. Extended narrative is a sustained, developed story that forms a significant portion of a text rather than a brief insert. Understanding the difference matters because each signals a different level of rhetorical investment. A writer who builds an entire essay around one narrative has made a much bolder structural choice than one who drops in a quick example. You also need to know narrative distance, which refers to how close or removed the narrator is from the events being described. A writer recounting their own childhood memory from the first-person present tense creates a feeling of immediacy and vulnerability. It collapses the distance between writer and reader. A writer describing the same event from a retrospective adult perspective introduces reflection, wisdom, and interpretation. The exam may ask you to analyze how narrative distance shapes the reader's relationship to the content or the credibility of the narrator. The common MCQ traps and FRQ pitfalls. Here's where students lose points, and it's almost always for one of two reasons. The first trap is confusing subject with strategy. If a passage about a personal experience, that doesn't automatically mean the writer is using narrative as a rhetorical strategy. Look for evidence of shaping. Does the story have a beginning, a turn, a point of significance? Is the writer using pacing, specific detail, or a moment of tension to create meaning? If the answer is yes, you're looking at deliberate narrative strategy. If it reads like a flat recitation of facts, it may simply be exposition. The second trap is stopping at identification. On the FRQ, especially the rhetorical analysis essay, students will correctly note that the writer uses an anecdote, then say nothing more. That earns almost no credit. The scoring rubric rewards you for explaining the function and effect of the strategy. Your claim should sound something like, by opening with the story of her grandmother's immigration, the writer establishes an emotional and personal stake in the policy debate before introducing statistical evidence, making the data that follows feel not abstract but urgently human. That's the difference between a 3 and a 5. Connections across the course. Narrative doesn't live in isolation in AP Lang. Understanding it here in Unit 4 pays dividends throughout the rest of the course. In Unit 2, when you studied appeals and argumentation, you learned that evidence comes in many forms. Narrative is one of them, and it's often the most rhetorically complex because it simultaneously operates on emotional and logical registers. In Unit 5, when you study comparison and contrast, you'll encounter writers who use parallel narratives to draw out distinctions or similarities. Narrative structure itself becomes the logical architecture. And in the synthesis essay on the AP exam, you may encounter a personal narrative as one of your provided sources. Knowing how to treat it as evidence, understanding its particular kind of authority and its limitations, is essential to a high-scoring response. The core insight to carry with you is this. In AP Lang, there is no purely expressive writing that has no rhetorical dimension. Every story a writer chooses to tell, and every story they choose not to tell, is a rhetorical act. Your job is to read like a writer, to see the choices, name them precisely, and explain what they accomplish. With narrative as a foundation, we're now ready to explore how writers make specific stylistic choices within their narratives, which brings us to the craft of selecting detail, structuring scenes, and using point of view for maximum rhetorical effect. 4.2 Understand narrative structure. Let's talk about stories, because here's the thing. Human beings are story-making machines. Before we had spreadsheets or scientific papers or Twitter threads, we had campfires and stories. And what the AP language exam is really asking you to do in this section is to think like a story architect, to look beneath the surface of a piece of writing and understand how the author deliberately constructed the narrative to achieve a specific effect on you, the reader. This is one of those concepts that sounds deceptively simple until you realize how deeply it matters for your score. What is narrative structure and why does it matter? Narrative structure refers to the deliberate organizational framework an author uses to arrange events, ideas, and information in a piece of writing. Notice I said deliberate. That word is doing a lot of work. On the AP exam, you're never supposed to assume an author accidentally did something. Every choice is intentional. The order in which events appear, where a story begins, where it ends, what gets left out. These are all rhetorical decisions that serve the author's purpose. The College Board wants you to be able to do 3 things with narrative structure: identify it, analyze why the author made those structural choices, and explain how those choices contribute to meaning, tone, or argument. If you can do all 3 of those things fluently in writing and on multiple choice, you're operating at a 5 level. Chronological versus non-chronological structure. Think about the last time you watched a really good movie that started near the end of the story. Maybe you opened with a crime scene and spent the whole film working backwards. That disorientation, that sense of mystery, was a structural choice. Authors do the same thing. The most basic structure is chronological, where events unfold in the order they actually happened. It's the first this, then that, finally this structure that feels the most natural. But here's the thing, natural doesn't mean boring. Chronological structure can build extraordinary momentum, particularly in personal narratives or journalistic writing, where the author wants you to live through an experience alongside them. Non-chronological structures are where things get more interesting for the exam. The two you absolutely must know are in medias res and retrospective narration. In medias res, from the Latin meaning into the middle of things, drops you right into the action. A famous example, instead of starting with "I grew up in a small town," the writer opens with "I was already bleeding when the police arrived." That's in medias res. The effect is immediate tension and engagement. The author is betting that the urgency of the moment will hook you before you even understand the full context. Retrospective narration, by contrast, involves a narrator looking back on events that have already concluded. You'll see this constantly in personal essays and memoirs. The narrator exists in the present, reflecting on a past self. This creates a fascinating dual perspective: the naive self who lived through the events and the wiser self who now interprets them. On the AP exam, when you see phrases like "I didn't understand then" or "looking back now," you're watching retrospective narration at work. Ask yourself, what does that gap between past and present selves do for the reader? It usually creates irony, emotional resonance, or insight. Flashbacks, flash-forwards, and structural interruption. A flashback is a narrative device where the chronological flow is interrupted by a scene from the past. Think of it like a hyperlink. You're reading along, and suddenly you click back to an earlier memory. Authors use flashbacks to provide context, to reveal motivation, or to draw a contrast between who a person was and who they've become. The key analytical move here is to ask, why this moment? Why does the author choose to interrupt the present narrative with this particular past scene? That why is where your analysis lives. Flash forwards work the same way, but in the opposite direction. The narrative briefly jumps ahead before returning to the present timeline. They're less common in the nonfiction texts you'll see on the AP language exam, but they do appear, and they typically function to create dramatic irony. The reader knows something the characters or past narrator don't. Framing narratives and embedded stories. A framing narrative is essentially a story within a story. Picture those Russian nesting dolls. There's an outer narrative that contains and gives context to an inner narrative. You might encounter a piece where a journalist interviews a subject, and the subject tells their own story. The journalist's account is the frame. The subject's story is embedded inside it. On the AP exam, always ask what the relationship is between the frame and the embedded story. Does the frame validate the inner story, complicate it, undercut it? The answer to that question is usually central to the author's overall purpose. The common traps on multiple choice. Here's where students lose points. The most common MCQ trap is confusing structure with content. A question might ask you what effect a structural choice has, and one of the wrong answers will describe the topic of the passage rather than the effect of the structure. Don't fall for it. Always bring your answer back to purpose and effect. A second trap involves the word undermines. You might see a question ask whether the flashback supports or undermines the narrator's earlier claim. Students often pick supports by default because it sounds more positive. But authors frequently use structure to complicate or create tension with their own earlier statements. Read carefully for that kind of ironic or contradictory relationship. Connections to other units. Narrative structure doesn't exist in isolation. It's deeply connected to your work in rhetorical analysis across the whole course. In Unit 3, when you analyzed an author's choices in argumentation, you were doing a version of the same work you do here. Structure is a rhetorical choice. In Unit 6, when you write your own argument or synthesis essay, understanding narrative structure will help you arrange your evidence in a sequence that builds toward your conclusion rather than just presenting ideas randomly. The most sophisticated writers, the ones scoring 8s and 9s on FRQs, are the ones who understand that order is argument. On the FRQ, when you're asked to analyze a passage's structure, the rubric rewards specificity. Don't just say the author uses flashback, say which flashback, explain what it reveals, and connect it explicitly to the author's purpose or the passage's meaning. That three-part move, identify, explain, connect, is the scoring gold standard. Now that you understand how authors arrange narrative time and sequence, let's look at the specific narrative voices and perspectives that shape how those stories get told, because who is speaking turns out to be just as powerful as when they're speaking. 4.3 Understand narrative techniques. What is narrative, and why does the AP exam care? Let's start with something deceptively simple: a story. You already know what a story is. You've been telling and absorbing stories your entire life, from bedtime tales to Instagram captions to the way you explained to a friend why you were late. But here's what the AP language exam is really asking you to do. Stop being a passive reader and become an active analyst. It wants you to identify how a writer constructs a narrative and why those choices create specific effects. That shift from what happened to how it's told and why it matters is the heart of Unit 4. Narrative technique refers to the deliberate craft choices a writer makes when telling a story. Think of it like filmmaking. Two directors can shoot the same script and produce completely different emotional experiences depending on camera angles, lighting, and pacing. In prose, those camera choices are things like point of view, pacing, sequencing, characterization, and the management of time. The AP exam will ask you to name these techniques using precise College Board terminology, explain how they function in a specific passage, and argue about the effect they create on the reader. If you can do all three, name, function, effect, you are in 5 territory. Point of view, the narrative lens. The most foundational narrative technique is point of view, which College Board defines as the perspective from which a story is told. First-person narration uses I and places the narrator inside the story as a participant. This creates intimacy and immediacy. You feel close to the narrator, but it also limits information. The narrator can only know what they directly experience, witness, or are told. That limitation is not a flaw. It's a craft choice. When a first-person narrator misunderstands something or withholds information, a skilled author is doing that on purpose to create irony, suspense, or to reveal character. Third-person narration steps outside the story. When the narrator knows everything about every character's inner life, it's called omniscient. When the narrator stays close to one character's perspective, it's called limited third person. The distinction matters enormously on the exam. A common trap on multiple-choice questions is conflating third-person limited with first-person because both feel intimate and close. The difference is pronoun use and position. Is the narrator inside or outside the story? If you see she thought or he noticed, that's third-person even if it feels personal. Second-person narration, addressing the reader directly as you, is rare but appears in some essays and experimental prose. When you encounter it, ask immediately, what is the author gaining by pulling the reader directly into the narrative? It often creates discomfort, complicity, or universality. Time, sequencing, and pacing. Here's where narrative technique gets genuinely exciting because sophisticated writers treat time the way a jazz musician treats rhythm. They play with it deliberately. Linear, chronological narrative is the default. Events happen in the order they occurred, but writers routinely disrupt this for effect. A flashback is a scene that interrupts the present timeline to show something from the past. Think of it as a film cutting to a memory. On the AP exam, when you see a flashback, don't just label it, ask why the author positioned it here. A flashback placed right before a character makes a critical decision, usually reveals the emotional or psychological weight behind that decision. That's the analytical move the FRQ scorers want to see. A flash-forward or prolepsis gives readers a glimpse of the future before the story reaches it. This creates dramatic irony. You know something is coming that the characters don't, and it shapes how readers interpret everything in between. In medias res, a Latin phrase meaning in the middle of things, describes a narrative that begins mid-action rather than at the chronological beginning. Homer's Iliad opens in the middle of the Trojan War, not at its start. Essays and personal narratives on the AP exam frequently use this technique to hook readers immediately. Recognizing it and analyzing why the writer chose this entry point is a high-value FRQ move. Pacing refers to how quickly or slowly the narrative moves through time. A slow, detailed scene that covers 10 minutes of action across 3 pages is called scene or dramatized narration. A sentence that covers 5 years, she grew old in that house, and her children left one by one, is called summary. When a writer slows down dramatically, they are signaling importance. When they speed up with summary, they are managing what needs to be shown versus what just needs to be known. The exam loves asking why a writer dwells on one moment while rushing through another. Voice, tone, and the unreliable narrator. Voice is the personality of the narrator, as expressed through word choice, syntax, and attitude. It's what makes one first-person narrator sound like a cynical teenager and another sound like a wistful grandmother, even if both are narrating a similar event. Voice contributes directly to tone, the writer's or narrator's attitude toward the subject and the reader. This is where one of the most tested AP concepts lives, the unreliable narrator. An unreliable narrator is one whose account of events cannot be fully trusted, either because they lack information, are self-deceiving, or are deliberately deceptive. The key exam skill is recognizing the gap between what the narrator tells you and what the text implies. If a narrator describes a conversation warmly but the dialogue itself is cold and dismissive, you're meant to see through the narrator. That gap is where meaning lives. On an FRQ, pointing to that gap and analyzing what it reveals about character or theme is exactly the kind of sophisticated reading that earns top scores. Characterization and its 2 modes. Characters are revealed through 2 methods. Direct characterization, where the narrator simply tells you who a person is, he was a proud and selfish man, and indirect characterization, where the writer shows you through action, dialogue, thought, and others' reactions. The AP exam almost always rewards analysis of indirect characterization because it requires closer reading. When a character says one thing but does another, that tension is a craft choice loaded with meaning. Common traps and FRQ scoring notes. The most common MCQ trap is confusing the author's tone with the narrator's tone. These can be different, especially in ironic or satirical works. Always ask, is the narrator's attitude the one the author wants me to adopt, or is the author creating distance from the narrator for effect? A second frequent trap is mislabeling point of view when narrators address the audience. This is a rhetorical direct address, not a shift to second-person narration. For FRQs, the scoring rubric rewards a 3-part analytical move every time. Identify the technique, explain what it does in this specific passage, and connect it to the larger meaning or effect of the work. Vague identifications like the author uses flashback for effect earn 0 points. Specific, grounded claims earn full credit. These narrative techniques connect directly to Unit 3's work on argument and rhetorical choices. Because personal narrative essays, a central AP genre, use storytelling as their primary mode of persuasion. Understanding how a narrative is constructed helps you understand how it argues. Now that you can dissect how stories are told, let's turn to how writers select and sequence evidence within those stories, which brings us right to the craft of developing ideas across a longer piece. 4. Understand how storytelling contributes to argument. Here's something worth thinking about before we dive in. The most persuasive thing you've ever heard probably wasn't a statistic. It was a story. Maybe it was a friend telling you about a car accident that convinced you to wear your seatbelt, or a documentary about a single family that changed how you think about poverty. Stories get into us in ways that data alone simply can't. And on the AP language exam, understanding why that happens and how writers deliberately use it is exactly what this section is all about. What storytelling in argument actually means. The College Board calls this concept the use of narrative as a rhetorical strategy. What that means in practical terms is that a writer chooses to embed a story or story-like elements inside a larger argument in order to advance a claim. Notice that word, chooses. This is crucial for the AP exam. When you're analyzing a passage, you're not just identifying that a story exists. You're explaining why the author put it there and what argumentative work it does. That's the analytical move the exam rewards. A narrative within an argument can take several forms. It might be a full anecdote, a brief, self-contained story drawn from personal experience or observation. It might be a case study, which is a more detailed account of a specific person, event, or situation used to illustrate a broader point. It might be an extended example that unfolds over several sentences with scene setting, character, and tension. Or it might be something more subtle, a hypothetical scenario where the writer invites you to imagine a situation in order to feel the stakes of their argument. All of these fall under the umbrella of narrative, and all of them function rhetorically. Why narrative works, the rhetorical mechanics. Let's talk about why storytelling is so persuasive. Because understanding the mechanism helps you write sharper analysis. When an author tells a story, they're typically doing one or more of three things: establishing an emotional connection with the audience, making an abstract concept concrete and memorable, or giving a human face to what might otherwise be a faceless issue. Think about it this way. If I tell you that approximately 40 million Americans experience food insecurity each year, you'll nod, maybe feel a pang of concern, and move on. But if I tell you about a specific mother who skips meals so her children can eat, and I describe the exact moment she opens an empty pantry, suddenly that statistic has a heartbeat. That's the power of the particular over the general. The AP exam will ask you to recognize that writers use narrative to make abstract arguments feel immediate and human, and that this is a deliberate, persuasive choice, not just a stylistic decoration. This connects directly to your understanding of the rhetorical triangle from earlier units. Narrative is one of the most powerful tools of pathos. It generates emotional identification. But don't make the mistake of thinking that's all it does. A well-chosen story can also build ethos. When an author shares a personal narrative, they're often positioning themselves as someone with lived experience and therefore credibility. And narrative can even support logos by functioning as an illustrative example that gives evidence to a claim. On multiple-choice questions, you'll sometimes see answer choices that try to trap you by labeling a story as only an emotional appeal. Be careful, the correct answer often acknowledges that narrative serves multiple rhetorical functions simultaneously. How narrative functions within argument structure. Here's where a lot of students lose points, both on MCQs and on free response questions. They can identify that a story is present, but they can't articulate how it fits into the argument structure. The College Board specifically cares about this. A narrative can appear at the beginning of an argument as a hook that establishes the stakes before the thesis is introduced. Think of it as dropping the reader into the scene before pulling back to make the claim. This is called an in medias res opening in literary terms. And in rhetoric, its function is to generate immediate emotional investment so the reader is already on board before the argument even formally begins. Narrative can also appear in the middle of an argument as a supporting example that illustrates a point the writer has just made abstractly. Here, the story serves as proof, not statistical proof, but experiential proof, what the College Board sometimes calls an illustrative example. And narrative can appear at the end of an argument as a kind of closing image that crystallizes the argument's emotional and moral stakes, leaving the reader with a vivid impression rather than a dry summary. When you write about these structural choices in your FRQ responses, use the language of purpose. Don't say the author tells a story about a soldier to make you feel sad. Say, the author's anecdote about Corporal Martinez humanizes the abstract policy debate, shifting the audience's relationship to the argument from intellectual agreement to emotional commitment. That's the difference between a 2 and a 4 on the commentary scale. The edge cases and common traps. Now let's talk about where students go wrong. The most common MCQ trap involving narrative is the confusion between evidence and emotional manipulation. Some answer choices will characterize a story as a logical fallacy, specifically an appeal to emotion meant to distract from weak reasoning. Sometimes that's true, but often on the AP exam, the story is functioning as legitimate evidence and the correct answer acknowledges its argumentative validity. Your job is to evaluate whether the narrative is being used to support a claim or to substitute for reasoning. If the author provides a story and nothing else, with no broader data or reasoning to back it up, then you're looking at an anecdote used in place of evidence, a potential weakness. If the story illustrates a broader pattern that the author also supports through other means, it's functioning as legitimate rhetorical evidence. Another trap. Students often miss that narrative can reveal the author's assumptions about the audience. The type of story a writer chooses, whose perspective it centers, what details are included, what emotional response it seems designed to trigger, tells you a great deal about who the writer imagines is reading. This connects directly to your work on audience analysis from Unit 1. When a writer chooses a narrative, they're betting that their audience will identify with it. Analyzing that bet is sophisticated, exam-worthy thinking. Connecting the threads. This concept ties into nearly every other skill in the course. When you write your own argument in the synthesis or argument FRQ, you can strategically deploy a brief narrative, an anecdote or hypothetical, to humanize your claim and demonstrate rhetorical sophistication. Examiners reward writers who understand that argumentation isn't just about logical structure, it's about moving people. The best arguments, as rhetoricians have known since Aristotle, do both at once. Understanding how storytelling contributes to argument also deepens your work with voice and style, which is exactly where we're headed next, because the way an author tells a story is just as revealing as the story itself. 4.5 Point of view and its effect on narrative. Let's talk about something that shapes every single piece of writing you'll encounter on the AP English Language exam. And yet it's one of those concepts students often treat as a throwaway detail, something to identify and move on from. Point of view is not just a label. It's a lens, a filter, a set of rules that governs what a narrator can see, say, feel, and know. Choosing a point of view is one of the most consequential rhetorical decisions a writer makes, and your job on the AP exam is to explain not just what the point of view is, but why it matters, what it reveals, what it conceals, and what effect it creates on the reader. The 3 core points of view and what they actually do. Think of point of view as the camera position in a film. You can mount the camera on one character's shoulder, float it above the entire scene, or hand it to one character who keeps turning it on themselves. Each position gives you radically different footage. First person uses I or we and places the narrator inside the story as a participant. This creates intimacy, immediacy, and a powerful sense of authenticity. You feel like you're receiving a confession or a first-hand account. But here's the critical nuance for the AP exam. First-person narrators are inherently limited and often unreliable. They can only know what they have experienced, witnessed, or been told. When you see a first-person narrator on the exam, ask yourself immediately, what does this narrator not know? What might they be misinterpreting? What biases or emotional investments color their account? Second person uses you, and while it's rare in literary nonfiction, you will encounter it, especially in essays, instructional prose, and experimental writing. When a writer uses you, they're doing something aggressive and intimate at once. They're collapsing the distance between text and reader, pulling you into the experience whether you like it or not. On the AP exam, if you see second person, think about what that rhetorical move accomplishes. It can create universality, urgency, or even discomfort, depending on context. Third person is the broadest category, and you need to distinguish between its subcategories with precision. Third person, omniscient, gives the narrator godlike access. They can enter any character's mind, reveal backstory, and comment on events the characters themselves don't understand. Third person, limited, zooms in on one character's perspective while maintaining the distance of he, she, or they, and third person objective, sometimes called the dramatic or cinematic mode, reports only observable action and dialogue, offering no access to interior thought whatsoever. The College Board expects you to name these distinctions and, more importantly, to explain their rhetorical effects. Reliability, bias, and the unreliable narrator. Here's where the exam really starts to separate strong students from excellent ones. The concept of the unreliable narrator is one of the most tested ideas in AP Lang, and it connects directly to your understanding of rhetoric, argument, and evidence. An unreliable narrator is not simply one who lies. Unreliability is more subtle and more interesting than that. A narrator might be limited by youth and inexperience, like a child who describes adult conflict without understanding it. A narrator might be emotionally compromised, grieving or in love, and therefore unable to see clearly. A narrator might be self-serving, unconsciously shaping the story to cast themselves in a favorable light. When the AP exam presents you with a first-person passage, you're being tested on your ability to read between the lines, to see what the narrator's choice of words, tone, and selective focus reveal about their biases and blind spots. This connects directly to Unit 3's work on analyzing argument and rhetorical appeals. An unreliable narrator is, in a sense, an unreliable rhetorical speaker. Their ethos is compromised, their logic may be distorted by emotion, and their selective use of evidence tells you as much as what they actually say. When you write about a first-person narrator in an FRQ, don't just say the narrator is biased. Anchor that claim in specific textual evidence, particular word choices, omissions, contradictions, or moments where the narrative seems strained. How point of view shapes, meaning the FRQ connection on the AP exam's free response questions. Especially the rhetorical analysis essay, you will be expected to discuss point of view as a rhetorical choice with specific effects. The trap that costs students points is describing point of view without connecting it to meaning. Saying the author uses first person earns you nothing. Saying the author's use of first-person narration creates a confessional intimacy that positions the reader as a trusted confidant, making the argument more persuasive because the audience feels personally addressed. That's the kind of analysis that earns a high score on the rubric. Practice completing this sentence every time you identify a point of view. The use of point of view creates effect, which connects to the author's larger purpose or argument. That three-part structure, identification, effect, purpose, mirrors exactly what AP exam scorers are looking for in your commentary. Common traps on the MCQ section. Multiple choice questions about point of view often exploit two specific confusions. First, students mix up narrator and author. The narrator is a textual construct, a voice created by the author. They are not the same person, even in nonfiction and memoir, where the authorial I is a crafted persona. Always refer to the narrator or speaker in your analysis, not the author, unless you are making a claim about the author's rhetorical choices as a whole. Second, students confuse limited third person with first person when the narrative is very close and intimate. If the pronouns are he, she, or they, you are in third person no matter how deeply you are inside a character's consciousness. The pronouns are the test. Read them carefully. Another MCQ trap involves questions about what a shift in point of view accomplishes mid-passage. If a narrator moves from distant third to close intimate third, or suddenly inserts a second-person address, that shift is never accidental. Ask what the writer gains from that tonal or positional change. Usually it's emphasis, intimacy, or a deliberate disruption of reader comfort. Connecting to the bigger picture, point of view sits at the intersection of nearly every unit in AP Lang. In Unit 3, it shapes how we assess the credibility and bias of argumentative sources. In Unit 5, on structure and form, the choice of narrator influences how information is sequenced and what gets emphasized. In Unit 6, on style and tone, the voice of the narrator is the style. First-person confession sounds nothing like third-person omniscience, and those differences in diction, syntax, and intimacy are precisely what you're analyzing when you discuss an author's style. Understanding point of view deeply means understanding that every piece of writing is a constructed perspective. Someone chose what to show you, and more importantly, what to hide. With that insight in hand, let's turn to how writers use structure and form to further shape the way readers experience a narrative. 4.6 Tone and Voice in Narrative Writing. Let's talk about something that separates good writers from great ones, and more practically, something that separates a 3 from a 5 on your AP exam. Tone and voice in narrative writing aren't just stylistic flourishes. They are the fundamental architecture of how a story communicates meaning. If rhetoric is the art of persuasion, then tone and voice are the instruments through which that persuasion is felt, rather than merely understood. Defining the terms voice versus tone. Start here, because the AP exam will absolutely test whether you can distinguish between these two concepts, and students confuse them constantly. Voice is the consistent, recognizable personality of the narrator or author as it comes through in the writing. Think of it like this. If you've ever texted a close friend and could immediately tell who sent the message based on word choice and rhythm alone, you've already experienced voice. Voice encompasses diction, word choice, syntax, sentence structure, pacing, the use of figurative language, and the degree of formality. Voice is relatively stable across a piece. It's the fingerprint of the writer or narrator. Tone, on the other hand, is the attitude the narrator or author expresses toward the subject matter, the audience, or the characters themselves. Tone shifts, it responds to the material. A writer might have a consistently sardonic voice, but within that voice, the tone might move from affectionately mocking to genuinely melancholic as the narrative progresses. The College Board is precise about this. Tone is attitudinal, and identifying it requires you to look at the accumulation of rhetorical choices, not just single words. Here's the analogy that tends to lock this in. Imagine a jazz musician. Their voice is the unique timbre of their instrument and their playing style, recognizable whether they're playing fast or slow. The tone is the particular mood of each performance, sometimes joyful, sometimes aching. Same musician, same instrument, different emotional register. How the AP exam tests this. On the multiple choice section, you'll often be asked to identify the tone of the passage or the narrator's attitude toward a subject. The trap here is picking an answer that feels emotionally right, but isn't precisely supported by the text. The AP exam rewards precision. Nostalgic and melancholic both involve looking backward and feeling something, but they aren't interchangeable. Nostalgic implies a bittersweet fondness. Melancholic implies a heavier sadness. Always ask yourself, what specific words or syntactic choices justify this label? If you can't point to the text, you're guessing. A related trap involves conflating the author's tone with a character's tone. In first-person narration especially, an author might use a narrator who is bitter and unreliable while the author's own attitude toward that narrator is ironic or even sympathetic. Joan Didion's narrators, for instance, often express a kind of cool detachment. But the authorial tone beneath that surface is frequently devastated. The exam will sometimes ask you to distinguish between what the narrator feels and what the implied author seems to want you, the reader, to feel. The technical tools of tone and voice. Here's where your analytical vocabulary has to be precise, because the FRQ rubric rewards specific evidence linked to specific effects. When you're identifying how an author creates tone, you're really cataloging rhetorical choices and their cumulative effect. Diction is your first stop. Word choice operates on multiple axes simultaneously. Denotation versus connotation, Latinate versus Anglo-Saxon roots. Latinate words like melancholy feel formal and literary. Anglo-Saxon words like sad or gut-wrenching feel immediate and visceral, and degree of abstraction. When a narrator describes a landscape as desolate versus empty, the connotative weight shifts dramatically. Even though the denotative meaning is similar, syntax is equally powerful and often underappreciated by students. Short, declarative sentences create urgency, bluntness, or emotional flatness depending on context. Long, winding, subordinate clause-heavy sentences create contemplation, anxiety, or even evasiveness. Ernest Hemingway's spare syntax produces a tone of stoic restraint. William Faulkner's serpentine sentences produce a tone of obsessive memory. When you're analyzing syntax for the exam, describe what the sentence structure does. Does it accelerate? Does it withhold? Does it pile on detail until the reader feels overwhelmed? Imagery and figurative language carry tremendous tonal weight. A metaphor that compares grief to a stone versus a metaphor that compares it to a wave produces fundamentally different tones. The stone implies permanence and weight. The wave implies the rhythm of coming and going, the possibility of receding on the FRQ. When you cite imagery, always explain the emotional or attitudinal effect it creates, not just what it describes. Narrative distance is a concept the AP exam has been testing with increasing sophistication. Narrative distance refers to how close or removed the narrator's perspective is from the events and characters being described. A close narrative distance intimate, present, emotionally involved, typically produces a confessional or urgent tone. A distant narrative distance, retrospective, measured, sometimes ironic, often signals a tone of reflection, wisdom, or critical detachment. James Baldwin often narrows narrative distance to devastating emotional effect. His tone becomes searingly immediate. Compare that to a writer using a retrospective frame, looking back from years later, and you'll notice the tone becomes filtered, evaluated, sometimes rueful. Connecting this to the broader course. This section connects directly to Units 1 and 2, where you studied rhetorical situation and appeals. Tone is essentially the ethos and pathos dimensions of a narrator's rhetorical positioning. It establishes how the narrator wants to be perceived and how the narrator wants you to feel. When you analyzed argumentative essays, you asked what the writer wanted to persuade you of. In narrative, you ask what relationship the writer is creating between you, the narrator, and the subject matter. That relationship is constructed through tone and voice. This also connects to Unit 3's work on style analysis. Everything you learned about identifying stylistic choices in nonfiction prose applies here, but in narrative writing, those choices are embedded in a story, so you must be alert to how the events of the narrative affect tone shifts. A tone that begins as confident may become ironic by the end once the narrator has experienced failure. That arc is itself a rhetorical argument. The FRQ scoring reminder for the synthesis and rhetorical analysis FRQs, simply naming a tone earns you nothing. The scoring rubric rewards the chain. Identify the choice, explain the effect on tone or voice, then connect that to the broader purpose or meaning of the passage. Think of it as a three-link chain: choice, effect, significance, and make sure every analytical claim you make about tone completes all three links. With a solid grasp of how tone and voice operate in narrative, you're beautifully positioned to tackle what comes next. The complex relationship between narrator perspective and reliability, where tone becomes one of your most important clues that something or someone in the story might not be entirely trustworthy. 4.7 Using personal anecdote as evidence. Let's talk about something that feels almost too human for an academic exam: the personal story. You've been telling stories your whole life. You told your parents what happened at school. You texted your friends about the weird thing that happened at the coffee shop. You wrote college essays about moments that changed you. And here's the good news. That instinct you already have for storytelling is genuinely useful on the AP language exam. The trick is learning when and how to harness it, because on this test, a personal anecdote is a rhetorical tool, not just a diary entry. What a personal anecdote actually is. A personal anecdote, as the College Board defines it in the context of AP Lang, is a brief narrative drawn from the writer's own experience that serves as evidence to support a claim. Notice the key phrase there: serves as evidence. That's what separates a strategic anecdote from rambling autobiography. The moment you sit down to write an argument or synthesis essay, every word you put on the page needs to be pulling rhetorical weight. A personal anecdote isn't decoration, it's a carefully deployed piece of reasoning. Think of it the way a carpenter thinks about a well-placed nail. It has a specific job to do in the structure of the argument, and if it's in the wrong place, the whole thing wobbles. The rhetorical function of anecdote. Here's where the conceptual depth comes in. Personal anecdotes function primarily as a form of inductive reasoning. You are presenting one specific, concrete case and inviting the reader to draw a broader conclusion from it. When essayist David Sedaris tells you a story about his chaotic childhood Christmas to make a point about American consumer culture, he's not just being charming, he's using the particular to illuminate the universal. That movement from the specific to the general is the engine of the anecdote as evidence. This connects directly to the rhetorical appeals you've been studying throughout this course. An anecdote is one of the most powerful ways to deploy pathos, because it gives an abstract idea a human face and an emotional temperature. But notice, and this is crucial for the exam, a well-used anecdote also builds ethos. When a writer shares a personal experience that is relevant and credible, It positions them as someone with genuine authority to speak on the subject. A doctor writing about patient care who opens with a moment from their own rounds isn't just tugging heartstrings. They're establishing that they've been in the room. They've earned the right to this argument. Where students get into trouble, and where you can expect MCQ traps to lurk, is in confusing emotional resonance with logical sufficiency. An anecdote alone does not constitute a complete logical argument. It is one form of evidence, and on the exam, you need to recognize that anecdotes are illustrative and supportive rather than conclusive. A single personal story cannot prove a universal claim. If a writer says, "I once met a rude cashier, therefore all retail workers are rude," that's the logical fallacy of hasty generalization. The AP exam absolutely will test your ability to identify when an anecdote is being used appropriately versus when it's being stretched beyond its evidential weight. When to use it in your own writing. On the free response question, particularly the argument essay, using a personal anecdote is absolutely a legitimate and sometimes excellent rhetorical choice. But here's the decision rule you need to internalize. Use a personal anecdote when the specificity and emotional immediacy of your lived experience genuinely strengthens your claim in a way that abstract reasoning alone cannot. Use it as an entry point or an illustration, not as the load-bearing foundation of your entire argument. Think of it architecturally. Your argument is a house. Your thesis is the foundation. Your logical reasoning, your warrants, your evidence, your analysis, those are the walls and beams. A personal anecdote is a beautifully placed window. It lets light in. It makes the space feel real and livable. But you cannot build a house out of window. The scorer reading your FRQ is looking for sophistication, and one hallmark of a sophisticated argument is knowing how to blend different types of evidence. Personal experience alongside data, alongside textual evidence, alongside broader cultural or historical examples. The student who opens with a powerful anecdote and then builds outward toward larger evidence is demonstrating exactly the kind of rhetorical control the rubric rewards. Common traps and how to avoid them. The most common mistake on the argument FRQ is what you might call the all anecdote, no argument essay. A student writes passionately and specifically about their personal experience for 3 full paragraphs, and the result is emotionally engaging but argumentatively thin. The evidence is vivid but narrow. The reader is left thinking, this is one person's story, why should I accept the broader claim? You avoid this trap by making sure your anecdote is always explicitly connected to the larger argument through analysis. Don't just tell the story. Explain what it proves, why it's representative, and how it supports your central claim. On the multiple choice section, you'll encounter questions asking you to identify the purpose or effect of a personal anecdote within a passage. Wrong answer traps often include choices that label the anecdote purely as emotional manipulation. Pathos bait, if you will, while ignoring its simultaneous function as ethos building or as a structural transition. Always ask yourself, what is all the rhetorical work this passage element is doing? The correct answer on these questions is almost always the most complete one. Connections across the course. Personal anecdote connects beautifully to Unit 3's work on argument structure and evidence, since you're constantly making choices about which type of evidence serves which purpose. It also links to Unit 5's work on style and tone. The voice of a personal anecdote is almost always more intimate and direct than other evidence types, which shifts the rhetorical relationship between writer and reader. When you're analyzing a source in the synthesis FRQ, you might encounter an author who uses personal narrative as one of their source's central strategies, and you need to be able to evaluate its effectiveness critically and incorporate or respond to it appropriately. One final distinction worth locking in. A personal anecdote comes from the writer's own experience, while an anecdote more broadly can come from someone else's story. On the exam, personal anecdote always signals first-person lived experience. Don't confuse it with a hypothetical scenario or a parable. Those are different rhetorical moves with different evidential status. When you understand the personal anecdote not as a casual aside, but as a precision rhetorical instrument, you start using it with the kind of intentionality that earns you points, and that's exactly where we're headed as we move into our next section on how writers craft narrative voice and use perspective to shape audience response. 4.8 Figurative Language and Narrative Contexts. Let's talk about something that separates a good AP essay score from a great one. And it's something most students overlook because they think they already know it. Figurative language. You learned about metaphors in 6th grade, right? You can spot a simile from a mile away. But here's the thing. The AP exam doesn't just want you to identify figurative language. It wants you to explain what it does, how it shapes meaning, creates tone, advances the narrative, and reveals character. That's a completely different skill. And today we're going to build it from the ground up. What the College Board actually wants when College Board talks about figurative language and narrative contexts, they're asking you to analyze how writers use non-literal language to accomplish rhetorical and artistic purposes within a story or narrative passage. The key phrase is in narrative contexts, which means the figurative language is doing work inside a story. It's revealing a character's psychology, compressing time, building atmosphere, or making the abstract feel concrete and urgent. Your job on the exam is to trace that work, not just label it. Trace it. The AP language course distinguishes between several categories you need to know precisely. A metaphor makes a direct comparison without using like or as. It asserts that one thing is another. A simile makes a comparison using like, as, or as though, leaving a small logical gap between the two things that the reader's mind has to bridge. That gap is actually meaningful. Similes tend to feel more tentative, more reaching, while metaphors feel more assertive and intimate. A personification attributes human qualities to non-human things, and in narrative writing this often signals how a character projects their inner emotional state onto the world around them, which is called pathetic fallacy, when it involves nature or the environment. Know both terms. College Board uses both. Extended metaphor is one of the most tested concepts here. When an author introduces a metaphorical comparison and then sustains and develops it across multiple sentences or even an entire passage, every layer of that extension becomes meaningful. Think of it like a bridge being built between two worlds. Each new plank the writer adds strengthens and complicates the relationship. When you see an extended metaphor on the exam, your job is to track all the ways the metaphor plays out and then explain what the accumulation of those comparisons achieves. One MCQ trap to avoid. Students often identify the opening metaphor and stop there, missing the development that the question is actually testing. Tone, character, and narrative voice. Here's where it gets really rich. In narrative writing, figurative language doesn't exist in isolation. It's embedded in a narrator's or character's voice, and that means it reveals psychology. When a narrator describes grief as a house with all its lights turned off, that simile tells you something about how this person processes loss, quietly, domestically, in terms of absence rather than violence. Compare that to a narrator who describes grief as a tide that just kept rising. Same emotion, completely different emotional architecture. On the FRQ, if you're analyzing a narrative passage, you should always ask yourself, whose figurative language is this? What does their choice of comparison reveal about their perspective, state of mind, or values? This connects directly to Unit 3's work on rhetorical appeals and persona. In narrative writing, a narrator's figurative choices construct their ethos. They tell us how educated, how emotional, how self-aware, how ironic that narrator is. A narrator who reaches for classical allusions and metaphors feels very different from one who uses sports analogies. Both are using figurative language. Both are constructing a relationship with the reader. Your analysis should notice that construction. Hyperbole and understatement, also called litotes when it involves a double negative, are often paired on the exam because they work as opposites and because both can be used for ironic or comedic effect, or for devastating emotional emphasis. Hyperbole in narrative writing magnifies reality to expose emotional truth. Understatement minimizes reality to create either dignity, irony, or restraint. When a character who has just survived a catastrophe says that was a bit inconvenient, the gap between what happened and how it's described is doing enormous rhetorical work. On the MCQ, wrong answer traps often confuse the device with the effect a question might offer. The hyperbole creates drama as one answer, and the hyperbole creates irony as another. You need to read the context carefully. Hyperbole is only ironic when the exaggeration is obviously absurd in relation to tone. Symbolism and the edge cases. Symbolism is a step beyond figurative language but lives in the same neighborhood. A symbol in a narrative is a concrete object, place, or action that carries consistent meaning beyond its literal function. The difference between a symbol and a metaphor is that a symbol is present in the story. The green light at the end of Daisy's dock is actually in the scene. Fitzgerald doesn't say Gatsby's dreams were like a green light. The light is there and it accumulates meaning across the narrative. When answering MCQs about symbolism, watch for the trap of overreading. Not every object is symbolic, and College Board questions will sometimes test whether you can distinguish a symbolically loaded detail from one that simply serves literal plot function. Allusion is another device that appears frequently in narrative passages. When a writer references mythology, scripture, history, or literature inside a narrative, that reference imports a whole world of associations in just a few words. Your job is to explain what those associations contribute. Does the allusion elevate a character by comparing them to a heroic archetype, or does it deflate them ironically by suggesting they're falling short of that archetype? The FRQ scoring reality. On the rhetorical analysis FRQ, which you will almost certainly encounter, the scoring rubric rewards what College Board calls a line of reasoning, a claim evidence commentary structure, where your commentary specifically explains how a device creates meaning or achieves an effect. The trap students fall into is writing, the author uses a metaphor to make the writing more vivid. That earns no credit. What earns credit is the extended metaphor comparing the narrator's isolation to a ship losing sight of shore gradually shifts from navigational language to weather language, suggesting that her alienation moves from a condition she might correct to one that feels elemental and inevitable. That's commentary. That's what a 5 looks like. Always connect figurative language to the passage's larger argument or narrative arc. A metaphor that appears once is interesting. A metaphor that echoes across a passage and transforms is thematically significant. That transformation, watching figurative language evolve, is what the most sophisticated responses analyze. As you move into the next section, you'll see how these figurative devices don't just beautify language, but actively build the structural logic of an argument, which is exactly where we're headed when we explore how authors use analogy and comparison as tools of persuasion. 4.9 Pacing, Scene, and Summary in Narrative. The Director's Chair, How Storytellers Control Time. Imagine you're watching a film and suddenly the camera lingers on a single character's face for what feels like a full minute. Every tear, every tremor, every flicker of emotion playing out in exquisite slow motion. Then, with a hard cut, a title card appears. 10 years later, in 2 seconds of screen time, a decade vanishes. That's the power of pacing, and as a narrative writer, and as an AP exam reader, understanding how authors manipulate time is absolutely essential. Pacing, at its core, is the relationship between narrative time and story time. Story time is how long events actually take in the fictional world. Narrative time is how long the author spends telling you about those events. When an author stretches a single heartbeat across 3 pages, that's a choice. When an author collapses an entire childhood into a single sentence, that's also a choice. Your job on the AP exam is to identify those choices, name them precisely, and explain why a skilled writer made them. Scene, living inside the moment. The first major technique you need in your toolkit is scene. A scene operates in something close to real time, or at least creates that illusion. It includes rendered dialogue, sensory details, specific physical action, and the interior thoughts of characters. Think of it as the author pressing the slow-motion button. The camera gets close and you feel as though you're inside the moment as it unfolds. Consider this. If a character is having a devastating argument with her mother, and the author writes 4 paragraphs of back-and-forth dialogue describing the way the kitchen light flickers, the smell of burnt coffee, the exact words that cut deepest that is seen. The author has decided this moment is too important to rush. They are saying to you, the reader, pay attention here. This is where meaning lives. For the AP exam, you need to recognize that scene as a signal of thematic weight. Authors slow down for scenes when the content carries emotional, moral, or thematic significance. When you encounter a passage rich in scene, ask yourself why the author chose to expand time here. The answer will almost always connect to character development, the central conflict, or the text's larger argument about human experience. Summary. Covering ground at speed. Summary is the opposite maneuver. It is the narrative equivalent of fast-forwarding through the commute to get to the destination. In summary, the narrator condenses events, sometimes years, sometimes entire relationships, into a sentence or a short paragraph. She spent the next decade rebuilding her life is pure summary. Nothing is rendered in detail. The author is simply moving you from one meaningful moment to the next. Summary is not a lesser technique, it's a strategic one. Every author uses summary to control emphasis. By rushing through certain periods, the writer implicitly tells you those events are less important than what comes before and after. Summary also creates rhythm. A narrative that operates entirely in scene becomes exhausting and claustrophobic, like a film with no establishing shots. Summary gives readers room to breathe, provides context, and creates the contrast that makes scenes hit harder when they arrive. A classic AP exam trap here is to assume that summary means unimportant. Don't fall for it. Sometimes an author compresses something painful precisely because the compression itself is meaningful. A character who skips over an entire abusive relationship in a single sentence might be revealing their own emotional avoidance, their desire not to dwell. The content of the summary matters, but so does the fact that it is summary at all. Pacing as rhetorical argument. Here is the insight that separates a score of 3 from a score of 5. Pacing is not just a structural choice, it is a rhetorical one. When an author slows down or speeds up, they are making an argument about what matters. They are shaping the reader's emotional and intellectual experience to lead toward a particular understanding. This is exactly the kind of thinking the AP language exam rewards. Think of it this way. A journalist writing a narrative nonfiction piece about a car accident might spend 5 pages in slow-motion scene on the moment of impact. The screech, the glass, the sudden silence, and then cover the next 3 years of recovery in a single paragraph. By making that choice, the journalist argues that the crash itself is the defining, rupturing event, while the recovery, however long, is in some sense secondary. You can agree or disagree with that framing, but recognizing that the pacing is doing argumentative work is the crucial move on FRQs. Especially the synthesis and rhetorical analysis tasks, you will earn scoring points by identifying a specific pacing technique and connecting it directly to the author's purpose or the text's effect on the audience. The rubric rewards precise naming. The author uses extended scene to evidence from the text and a clear explanation of effect. Don't just say the author slows down. Say why, and say what it does to you as a reader. Where scene meets summary, the transition zone. One edge case that trips up students on multiple-choice questions is the moment when scene and summary blend. Some passages include what scholars call summary within scene, a moment that feels rendered and present but actually compresses time slightly. A character might think, every morning for a year she had watched the sunrise from that window, which is technically a summary of repeated behavior, but presented with the immediacy of a scene-like thought. On the MCQ, if you see answer choices debating whether a passage is primarily scene or primarily summary, look for the dominant mode, the verb tense, and the presence or absence of specific sensory detail as your deciding factors. Connecting to the rest of the course, this topic connects directly to Unit 4's broader exploration of narrative choices, but it also reaches into Unit 1's work on rhetorical situation because pacing is always a response to audience and purpose. It connects to Unit 3's examination of line of reasoning. Just as an argument has a logical structure, a narrative has a temporal structure, and both are designed to move a reader toward a conclusion. When you read any narrative passage on the AP exam, whether in a prose passage analysis or an argument prompt, ask yourself, where does time speed up? Where does it slow down? And what does that rhythm reveal about what the author values? The best way to practice is to take any piece of narrative you love, a memoir, a personal essay, a short story, and map its pacing like a topographer mapping terrain. Find the mountains, the long, slow scenes where the author lingers, and find the valleys, the quick summaries that bridge moments. The shape of that map is the author's argument, and with that sense of narrative rhythm in your ear, we're ready to move into how authors use point of view and perspective to further shape the story's emotional and rhetorical impact. 4.10. How narrative appeals to pathos. Let's talk about something you already know how to do instinctively. Make people feel things. Think about the last time you told a story to convince someone of something. Maybe you were explaining to a parent why you needed a later curfew, and instead of rattling off statistics about teen safety, you told them about your responsible friend who got stranded at a party because they had no way home. Without realizing it, you were doing exactly what writers have done for centuries. You were using narrative to appeal to pathos. What pathos actually means and what it doesn't. Pathos is one of Aristotle's 3 rhetorical appeals, alongside logos, logic, and evidence, and ethos, credibility, and character. On the AP exam, pathos refers specifically to the appeal to the audience's emotions, values, and sense of shared humanity. But here is the critical distinction College Board wants you to make. Pathos is not manipulation, and it is not mere sentimentality. When writers use pathos effectively, they are creating an emotional experience that is also intellectually honest. The feeling illuminates the argument rather than replacing it. This is the first major trap students fall into on both the multiple choice and the FRQ sections. If you describe a writer's emotional appeal as manipulative or cheap, you are making a value judgment rather than a rhetorical analysis. The AP exam wants you to explain how pathos functions and why it works, not whether you personally approve of it. Practice separating your own emotional response from your analytical observation. How narrative creates emotional connection. Narrative, as you learned earlier in Unit 4, is the deliberate telling of events, real or imagined, to achieve a purpose. When a writer embeds a story inside an argument, something powerful happens. Abstract ideas become concrete human experiences. Consider how much more affecting it is to read about one specific child going to bed hungry in a particular apartment on a particular cold November night than to read that approximately 13 million children in the United States experience food insecurity. Both statements convey truth, but only one makes you feel that truth in your chest. This technique has a name that shows up in rhetorical scholarship and occasionally in AP exam language, the identified individual effect, sometimes called the singularity effect. Research in psychology confirms what good writers have always known. Humans respond more strongly to one vivid, specific story than to large-scale statistical evidence. On your FRQ, when you identify a writer using a personal anecdote or a single illustrative story, you should explain this mechanism. The specificity of the narrative creates identification and emotional proximity for the reader, which makes the argument feel urgent and personal rather than distant and abstract. The tools narrative uses to build pathos. When writers deploy narrative for emotional effect, they reach for a predictable toolkit, and you should be able to name and analyze each instrument. Vivid sensory detail places the reader inside a scene, the smell of a hospital corridor, the sound of a child's laughter, and activates what's sometimes called narrative transportation, the psychological state in which a reader is so immersed that their defenses lower and emotional engagement heightens. This is why the most effective persuasive writing often reads almost like fiction. Characterization matters enormously here. A narrator or subject who feels fully human, who has contradictions, specific habits, a particular way of speaking, generates empathy more effectively than a flat, generic representative figure. When Annie Dillard describes her childhood self in An American Childhood, or when George Orwell puts himself in the position of a colonial police officer in Shooting an Elephant, the specificity of character is doing emotional work. The reader thinks, I recognize this person. I could be this person. That recognition is pathos in action. Pacing and structure also shape emotional response in ways the AP exam will ask you to analyze. A writer who slows down and lingers on a painful moment, stretching a single scene across several paragraphs, is signaling to the reader that this moment deserves grief or outrage. Conversely, a writer who moves rapidly through events can create a sense of chaos or overwhelm. When you annotate a passage for your FRQ, ask yourself, where does the writer slow down and why? The answer almost always connects to emotional emphasis. Distinguishing pathos from logos and ethos in narrative contexts. Here is where AP students frequently lose points. A personal anecdote can function as more than just pathos, and you need to identify which appeal is primary. If a doctor narrates a specific patient case to illustrate the effectiveness of a treatment, that story is primarily serving logos. It is functioning as evidence. If the same doctor tells a story of her own early struggles with medicine to establish that she understands patient suffering, that story is primarily serving ethos. But if the point of the story is to make you feel the weight of a patient's suffering in order to motivate action, it is primarily pathos. The overlap is intentional and sophisticated, and the best AP essays acknowledge it. You might write something like, while the anecdote functions as evidence supporting the author's claim, its primary rhetorical purpose is emotional. The specific, intimate details of the patient's final days appeal to the reader's compassion in ways that statistical data cannot. That kind of nuanced analysis is what separates a 6 from a 4 on your rhetorical analysis FRQ. Common exam traps to watch for. Beyond confusing the appeals, students often make one of two errors. They either underexplain the effect of a narrative moment, identifying that it creates emotion without explaining which emotion or why that emotion serves the argument, or they overclaim, saying the story proves the writer's point when narrative alone proves nothing. It supports, illustrates, or humanizes an argument. College boards scoring rubric rewards precision. Say the anecdote invites the reader to feel grief, and then explain why grief is rhetorically useful here. Also watch for passages where a writer seems to use pathos, but the narrative is actually undermining the argument, a kind of ironic or self-aware use of emotion. These passages test whether you can read critically rather than react emotionally alongside the author. Connections across units. This concept threads through the entire course. In Unit 2, when you analyzed how writers develop arguments, you were already thinking about why evidence choices matter. Narrative evidence is a pathos-driven choice. In Unit 3, you studied how structure shapes meaning, and now you can see how narrative structure specifically shapes emotional meaning. And in Unit 5 and beyond, as you write your own arguments, understanding how narrative appeals to pathos gives you a genuine tool. Sometimes the most honest, most persuasive thing you can do is tell a true story and let the reader feel what it means. With that emotional foundation firmly in place, let's turn our attention to how writers make deliberate choices about tone, because the feeling a narrative creates doesn't happen by accident. 4.11 The role of detail and specificity in storytelling. Let's start with a quick thought experiment. Imagine I tell you, a man walked into a room and felt sad. You receive that sentence, you understand it technically, but you don't feel anything, do you? Now try this. Marcus shuffled into the kitchen at 2 a.m., still wearing his father's old flannel shirt, and stood in front of the refrigerator for a full minute before realizing he wasn't hungry. Same basic idea, a man, a room, an emotion, but now you're there with him. That transformation, from the generic to the specific, is exactly what this section is about. And on the AP language exam, your ability to recognize, analyze, and deploy that technique is worth serious points. What specificity actually does? The College Board wants you to understand that detail and specificity in narrative writing are not decorative choices, they are rhetorical choices. Every specific detail a writer selects serves a function, it establishes credibility, it controls your emotional response, it creates what rhetoricians sometimes call verisimilitude, which is the quality of feeling true or real. When a writer names the brand of sneakers a character wears, the intersection where an accident happened, or the exact year a grandmother immigrated, That precision is doing argumentative work. It's saying to the reader, trust me, I was there, this is real, this matters. On the multiple choice section, when you see a question asking about the effect of a specific concrete detail, your first instinct should always be to ask, what does this detail make me believe, feel, or understand that a vaguer version would not? There's a concept closely tied to this called the concrete versus the abstract, and the AP exam tests this distinction constantly. Abstract language operates at the level of ideas, justice, love, suffering, progress. Concrete language operates at the level of the senses. A torn check, a bruised wrist, a dog barking at 3 a.m. Strong narrative writing typically moves between these two registers deliberately, using the concrete to earn the abstract. Joan Didion doesn't tell you that grief is disorienting. She tells you she kept returning to the idea that her husband might need his shoes, the ones she'd given away after he died. The specific irrational detail does more emotional and argumentative work than any abstract claim about grief could. Specificity as evidence in personal narrative. Here's where this concept lands directly on your FRQ scoring rubric, particularly for the narrative essay prompt. The College Board's rubric rewards what it calls development, and development in a narrative context means the strategic use of specific details to support the larger meaning you're building. A response that earns a 4 or 5 in the development row doesn't just tell a story, it selects details that illuminate something. Think of it this way. You are the attorney, and the specific detail is your exhibit. You don't drag every piece of evidence into the courtroom, you choose the ones that prove your case most efficiently and memorably. A common trap students fall into, and this appears on both the multiple choice and the FRQ, is confusing quantity of detail with quality of detail. More is not better. A paragraph stuffed with sensory descriptions that don't connect to the essay's central idea is actually a sign of weak rhetorical control. The AP exam will sometimes present you with a passage where a writer uses restraint, selecting just 1 or 2 precise details per scene, and the question will ask you to identify why this approach is effective. The answer is almost always about focus and trust. The writer trusts the reader, signals rhetorical confidence, and keeps every detail doing double duty. The difference between illustrative and decorative detail. This distinction is one of the most commonly tested edge cases on the AP language exam, and it's one students frequently miss. An illustrative detail is one that advances characterization, argument, or theme. It tells you something essential. A decorative detail is one that creates atmosphere or texture without doing deeper rhetorical work. Neither is inherently wrong, but the exam will ask you to distinguish between them. When a narrator describes the peeling yellow wallpaper in a hospital room, that detail might be purely atmospheric, or it might be a pointed symbol of institutional neglect. The question is always, why this detail? Why here? Why now? Train yourself to ask that every time you encounter a specific image in a passage. Connecting to the broader rhetorical framework. This concept doesn't exist in isolation. It connects directly to the rhetorical situation you've studied throughout this course. Specificity is one of the primary tools writers use to establish ethos, because precise details signal first-hand knowledge and authority. It connects to pathos because concrete sensory language creates emotional proximity. And it connects to logos because in personal and literary nonfiction, the specific anecdote functions as a form of evidence, an inductive building block that supports a larger claim. When you're analyzing a passage on the multiple choice section and you see a question about rhetorical appeals, don't overlook how detail and specificity are doing that appeal work beneath the surface. You'll also want to connect this to what you've learned about diction in earlier units. Word choice and specificity are 2 faces of the same coin. Choosing beige instead of light-colored, or muttered instead of said, or 1973 Chevrolet instead of old car, these are all acts of specification, and they all carry rhetorical weight. On a free response question, when you discuss an author's diction, pushing your analysis one level deeper to explain how the specificity of that diction serves the writer's purpose, will earn you commentary points that most students miss. The one trap you cannot afford to fall into. The single most common wrong answer on AP Language multiple choice questions about detail and specificity is this. Students identify what a detail describes, rather than analyzing what the detail does. If a question asks about the effect of a specific concrete image, and your instinct is to paraphrase the detail back, the author describes the grandmother's hands to show she worked hard, you've stopped one step too short. The AP-level answer goes further. The tactile specificity of the grandmother's cracked, flour-dusted hands creates an image of dignified labor that lends the narrator's eventual argument about immigrant contributions its emotional authority. See the difference? The first answer identifies content. The second analyzes function. That's the gap between a 3 and a 5. As you've now seen, specificity is not just a craft element. It's a full rhetorical strategy, and recognizing how it builds credibility, emotional resonance, and argumentative power is essential for the exam. Keep that lens ready as we move into our next section, where we'll look at how narrators construct and control perspective, and how point of view shapes everything a reader is allowed to see. 412 Narrator Reliability and Perspective Bias. Let's talk about something that might change how you read every story for the rest of your life. Imagine you're listening to your friend tell you about a fight they had with someone. They're passionate, convincing, maybe even in tears. And you believe them totally, completely. Then you hear the other person's version. Suddenly the story has a completely different shape. Neither person is lying exactly, but both are giving you a filtered version of the truth. That right there is the essence of narrator reliability and perspective bias, and the College Board wants to know that you can spot it, name it, and analyze what an author is doing with it. What is narrator reliability on the AP exam? When College Board talks about narrator reliability, they're asking you to evaluate the degree to which a narrator can be trusted to give an accurate, complete, and unbiased account of events. A reliable narrator presents information that the text as a whole supports. Their account aligns with the evidence we can gather from other parts of the story. An unreliable narrator, by contrast, gives us an account that the text itself undermines, contradicts, or complicates. The key move here is understanding that unreliability isn't a flaw, it's a craft choice. Authors create unreliable narrators deliberately, and your job on the exam is to explain why and to what effect. Think of it like a courtroom. The narrator is a witness on the stand. A reliable witness gives testimony consistent with the physical evidence. An unreliable witness might be lying, might be confused, might be self-deceived, or might simply lack the information needed to give a full account. The AP exam tests all 4 of those categories, so let's name them precisely. The 4 main sources of narrator unreliability are limited knowledge, self-interest or bias, emotional distortion, and deliberate deception. A child narrator like Scout in To Kill a Mockingbird is unreliable because of limited knowledge. She reports what she sees faithfully, but she doesn't always understand its full meaning. An adult narrator, defending their own past decisions like Stevens in The Remains of the Day, is unreliable because of self-interest. He rationalizes choices he can't bear to fully confront. A grieving narrator may distort events through emotional intensity. And occasionally a narrator simply lies to us, though that's the rarest and most dramatic form, and it's always purposeful. Perspective bias and how it works. Now, perspective bias is the concept that every narrator, even a seemingly neutral third-person voice, perceives events through a particular lens shaped by their identity, experiences, values, and position in the story. This is not the same as unreliability. A narrator can be entirely reliable and still carry significant perspective bias. Here's the distinction that trips up so many students. Unreliability is about accuracy. Perspective bias is about framing. Think of it this way. 2 photographers stand at the same event. One shoots from the front row, one from a balcony. Both photographs are accurate, neither one is fabricating anything, but they frame the event entirely differently based on where they're standing. Perspective bias works exactly like that. The narrator's vantage point determines what gets centered, what gets minimized, what emotional weight events carry, and even what vocabulary gets used to describe them. On the exam, you'll often be asked to analyze how a particular narrative perspective shapes meaning. That means you need to be thinking about things like whose story is being centered and whose is being sidelined. What assumptions does the narrator take for granted? What would the story look like if narrated by a different character? These aren't just literary theory questions, they are live AP free response questions about how rhetorical choices construct an argument or experience. The narration types you must know. You already know first, second, and third person from earlier units, but at this level you need finer distinctions. First-person narration almost always introduces the highest potential for unreliability, because the narrator is personally involved and reports only what they can perceive. Third-person limited restricts us to one character's consciousness, creating what's called focalization. The story is filtered through that character's perceptions, even though the narrator grammatically stands outside the story. Third-person omniscient narrators can theoretically access all information, which might seem reliable, but watch out. Even omniscient narrators make choices about what to reveal and what to withhold, and the author behind them is always shaping your experience. Second person is rare but shows up on exams. It aggressively recruits you into the narrator's perspective, which is itself a form of perspective manipulation worth discussing. Common exam traps. Here's where students lose points. The most common MCQ trap is conflating the author's perspective with the narrator's perspective. These are never the same thing. When an author creates an unreliable narrator, the author is not unreliable. They're using the narrator's unreliability to say something true. Always ask, what does the author want us to understand that the narrator doesn't? The gap between what the narrator tells us and what the text shows us is where meaning lives. A second trap is treating first-person narration as automatically unreliable and third-person narration as automatically reliable. Neither assumption holds. First-person narrators can be remarkably trustworthy, and third-person narrators can be deeply biased. Always look for textual evidence of unreliability rather than making assumptions based on point of view alone. For the free response questions, the scoring rubric rewards you for doing 3 things. Identifying the specific narrative technique, explaining how it works in the passage, and connecting it to the larger meaning or effect of the text. A student who says the narrator is unreliable because they lie earns fewer points than one who says the narrator's self-justifying language and selective omissions reveal an inability to confront their own culpability, which the author uses to implicate readers who too readily accept comfortable narratives. That second response shows analysis, not just identification. Connections across the course. This topic connects directly to the rhetoric work in Units 1 and 2 because perspective bias is essentially an extended study of ethos, the credibility and positioning of a speaker. It connects to Unit 3's work on argument and evidence because an unreliable narrator is essentially a case study in how selective evidence can shape perception. And it reaches forward into the synthesis and argument essays of Units 8 and 9, where you yourself must manage your own credibility as a writer and acknowledge the limitations of your own perspective. Understanding that every narrator, including you in your own essays, occupies a particular vantage point is one of the most sophisticated rhetorical moves you can make. With narrator reliability and perspective bias now in your analytical toolkit, you're ready to move into the way authors use structure and sequencing, including flashbacks, foreshadowing, and nonlinear timelines, to further control what readers know and when they know it. 4.13 Blending narrative with other rhetorical modes. Argument exposition. Let's talk about something writers do all the time that most readers never consciously notice, and that AP exam writers absolutely love to test. It's the art of blending narrative with other rhetorical modes. Think of it like a master chef who doesn't just make pasta or just make sauce. The magic is in the combination, in knowing when to pour a little story into an argument, or when to anchor an explanation in a human moment. That's exactly what we're unpacking today. What blending rhetorical modes actually means. First, a quick grounding in terms the College Board uses. A rhetorical mode is simply a strategy a writer uses to develop ideas and achieve a purpose. Narration tells a story with sequence and scene. Argumentation makes a claim and supports it with evidence and reasoning. Exposition explains, informs, or analyzes without necessarily taking a side. On the AP exam, you'll rarely encounter a passage that's purely one mode. Real writers blend them, and your job is to identify when and why. When a writer blends narrative with argument, they're doing something sophisticated. They're using a specific, often emotionally resonant story as the vehicle for a larger claim. Think of Ta-Nehisi Coates opening an essay by describing a particular afternoon with his son. That's not just storytelling for its own sake. It's a carefully chosen narrative entry point that makes his argument about systemic racism feel personal, urgent, and irrefutable in a way that statistics alone cannot. The story is the argument, at least until the writer steps back and makes the logical structure explicit. When a writer blends narrative with exposition, the purpose is slightly different. Here, the story isn't building toward a claim so much as it's illustrating an idea or concept. Imagine a science writer explaining how memory works by first telling the story of a patient who can't form new memories after a brain injury. The narrative grounds the reader before the explanatory content begins. You're being shown, then told. Why the blend matters, and what the exam tests. The AP exam cares about this topic for a very specific reason. It tests your ability to recognize rhetorical purpose. A key trap students fall into is treating narrative passages as purely personal or emotional, and therefore less rigorous than argumentative ones. Don't make that mistake. When you see a narrative passage on the multiple choice section, ask yourself immediately, what is the story doing rhetorically? Is it serving as evidence, establishing ethos, creating pathos to prime the reader for a logical turn? The story is always in service of something. On free response questions, especially the rhetorical analysis essay, students who score lower tend to describe what happens in a narrative passage rather than analyzing how the narrative functions. Describing is summarizing. Analyzing means you explain why the writer chose that story, what effect it creates, and how it connects to the writer's larger purpose. The scoring rubric specifically rewards commentary that addresses effect and purpose, not plot summary. The narrative-to-argument arc here's a framework worth memorizing. When a skilled writer blends narrative with argument, the structure often follows a recognizable arc. They open with a specific scene or anecdote, often in media res. That means you're dropped into the middle of action, not given a leisurely setup. That scene creates immediacy. Then the writer zooms out, moving from the particular to the general, from the individual story to the broader claim. This movement from specific to universal is one of the most powerful rhetorical moves in nonfiction, and it shows up constantly on the AP exam. James Baldwin does this masterfully. Frederick Douglass does it. Annie Dillard does it. You'll see a paragraph that feels novelistic, sensory detail, present tense urgency, a specific place and time, and then it pivots. The language becomes more abstract, thesis-like claims emerge. The writer is essentially saying, here's what I witnessed. Now here's what it means. Your job on the exam is to identify exactly where that pivot happens and what rhetorical work it does. Exposition embedded in narrative. The reverse move, embedding expository content inside a narrative, is equally important to recognize. A writer might be telling a personal story, but weave in contextual information, historical background, or definitional explanation mid-scene. This technique lets the writer educate the reader without stopping the forward momentum of the story. When Joan Didion writes about her grief in The Year of Magical Thinking, she moves fluidly between personal narrative and clinical, expository explanation of how the brain processes shock. The exposition doesn't interrupt the story, it deepens it. On the multiple choice section, a common question will ask you to identify the primary purpose of a paragraph that blends modes. Students often get tripped up because the paragraph feels emotional, so they choose an answer about pathos, when the actual primary purpose is to inform the reader about a concept necessary to understand the argument later. Always trace the function of the passage back to the writer's larger rhetorical situation, their purpose, audience, and context. Common confusions and MCQ traps. The most common confusion is between anecdote and evidence. An anecdote is a brief narrative used to illustrate a point. It's a form of evidence, but it's not data-driven. On the exam, wrong answer choices will sometimes distinguish between anecdote and evidence as though they're opposites. They're not. An anecdote is a type of evidence. Specifically, it's an appeal to experience or example. However, anecdotal evidence carries different rhetorical weight than statistical or logical evidence, and strong writers know how to use both together. Another trap, confusing tone with mode. A passage written in a warm, personal tone might still be primarily argumentative in mode. A clinical, detached tone doesn't necessarily mean the passage is expository rather than argumentative. Mode is about structure and purpose. Tone is about attitude and voice. Keep those separate. Connections to other units. This topic connects directly to Unit 3's coverage of appeals, logos, ethos, and pathos, because blending modes is often how writers deploy those appeals in layered ways. It connects to Unit 5 and Unit 6 as well, because when you're writing your own synthesis or argument essays, your best work will come from knowing when to drop into narrative to make your evidence feel alive. The College Board's scoring rubric for the argument, FRQ, specifically rewards sophisticated style and structure, and incorporating brief, purposeful narrative moments is one of the most effective ways to demonstrate that sophistication. As you move into our next section, you'll see how these blending techniques become especially powerful when writers use them to create a distinct voice and persona on the page, which is exactly where we're headed. 4.14 Reading and Analyzing Published Narrative Nonfiction, e.g. memoir, personal essay, literary journalism. What is narrative nonfiction, and why does it matter for the AP exam? Let's start with a question that trips up more students than you'd think. What makes narrative nonfiction different from any other kind of nonfiction you've already studied? Here's the key insight. Narrative nonfiction is true, but it's told. It's not just information delivered in an orderly way. It's information shaped into a story, complete with scene, character, tension, and emotional arc. Think of it this way. A Wikipedia article about the 1906 San Francisco earthquake gives you facts. But Joan Didion writing about grief, or John McPhee writing about geology, or Ta-Nehisi Coates writing letters to his son, that's narrative nonfiction. The facts are still real, but they've been crafted the way a novelist would craft them, which means your analytical job as a reader becomes beautifully complicated. For the AP Lang exam, this matters enormously. Narrative nonfiction passages appear regularly in the multiple-choice section and show up as the source texts for synthesis and rhetorical analysis free response questions. The College Board wants to see that you can read these texts at two levels simultaneously. You can appreciate what's happening in the story, and you can explain how and why the author made the choices they did to create meaning. The three major subgenres you need to know. Think of narrative nonfiction as an umbrella covering three main forms, each with its own conventions the exam will test you on. The memoir is a personal reflective account drawn from the author's own memory and experience. The key word here is selective. A memoirist doesn't just transcribe their life, they choose specific scenes and moments to reveal a larger truth. When you read a memoir passage on the AP exam, your first question should be, why this memory? What does the author want this particular scene to do for the reader? The personal essay is the memoir's close cousin, but there's an important distinction that students frequently confuse. A memoir tends to move through narrative time. It dramatizes scenes and builds toward revelation. A personal essay is more essayistic, meaning it weaves together anecdote, reflection, and argument more openly. The I in a personal essay is usually more explicitly thinking on the page, working through an idea. James Baldwin's essays, Annie Dillard's work in Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, or David Sedaris's comic personal essays all live in this space where story and idea braid together. When you see a personal essay on the exam, pay attention to how the author moves between narrating and reflecting. That movement is often where the rhetorical power lives. Literary journalism, sometimes called creative nonfiction journalism or narrative journalism, is where reported, researched, factual content gets rendered through literary techniques. Think of works like John Hersey's Hiroshima, Susan Orlean's The Orchid Thief, or almost anything in long-form outlets like The New Yorker. The author wasn't there as a main character. They researched, interviewed, observed, but they structure the resulting piece as a story with scenes, dialogue, and carefully built suspense. On the AP exam, a literary journalism passage might feel almost like fiction at first. Your job is to recognize that the literary choices are still rhetorical choices, even when the author isn't writing about themselves. The Analytical Toolkit, What to Look For. When you encounter any narrative nonfiction passage, you're applying the same core rhetorical analysis skills from Units 1 through 3, but you're also looking for a specific set of literary devices that narrative nonfiction deploys in ways that set it apart from argumentative prose. Scene and summary are your first pair. Scene is when the author slows the narrative down and renders a moment in vivid, real-time detail. Dialogue, sensory description, specific action. Summary moves quickly over time. For 3 years, she worked at the mill. Authors alternate between these deliberately, and the AP exam will sometimes ask why. A shift from summary to scene usually signals, this moment is what mattered most. Pay attention to those shifts. Voice and point of view are equally important. In first-person narrative nonfiction, you often have two versions of the narrator operating at once. The experiencing self, the younger, in-the-moment version inside the story, and the reflecting self, the older, wiser narrator, looking back with insight the experiencing self didn't yet have. Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, and countless others play these two selves against each other to create dramatic irony and emotional depth. On the AP exam, a common MCQ trap is treating the narrator's past perspective and present perspective as identical. They're not. Notice when the narrating voice steps back and reflects, that's almost always where the author's central claim or insight is being delivered. Structure and juxtaposition deserve your close attention, too. Narrative nonfiction writers often arrange scenes in non-chronological order to create meaning that straight chronology couldn't achieve. If an author opens with a scene from the middle of the story and then flashes back, ask yourself, what does starting here do to how you read everything that follows? Juxtaposition, placing two contrasting images, scenes, or ideas side by side, is one of the most powerful tools in this genre. It lets the author make a point without stating it explicitly, which is very much in keeping with the show-don't-tell principle these writers love. Common MCQ traps and FRQ pitfalls. One of the most reliable wrong answer traps in the multiple-choice section for narrative nonfiction passages is choosing an answer that identifies what happens in a passage rather than analyzing why the author made a specific choice. The AP exam is always asking about rhetorical purpose. Another frequent trap is misreading tone, because narrative nonfiction can be funny, lyrical, or quietly understated. Students sometimes describe the tone as neutral or objective, when it's actually carefully, emotionally calibrated. Almost no skilled narrative nonfiction writer is neutral. Even the restraint is a choice. For the free response questions, particularly rhetorical analysis, make sure you're not just identifying devices in isolation. The scoring rubric rewards commentary that connects the device to its effect on the reader and ultimately to the author's larger purpose. Saying the author uses imagery earns nothing. Saying the author's use of olfactory imagery when describing her grandmother's kitchen creates a sensory immediacy that collapses time. Positioning the reader to feel the narrator's grief as present and unresolved, that's the analysis that scores in the upper range. Finally, remember that narrative nonfiction connects back to everything you've studied about rhetoric in Units 1 through 3. Ethos, pathos, and logos don't disappear in a memoir, they work through different machinery. Pathos in a personal essay often operates through scene and specific detail rather than explicit emotional appeal. Ethos is built through the author's demonstrated honesty about their own limitations and complexity, not through credentials. Recognizing how classical rhetorical strategies get embedded in literary form is exactly the kind of sophisticated thinking the AP exam rewards. Understanding how narrative nonfiction works as a crafted form will serve you beautifully as we move into examining how authors of all kinds make deliberate stylistic choices, which is precisely what we'll be exploring next. 4.15 Writing the narrative portion of the AP free response question. FRQ 3, Prose Construal / Narrative Task. Alright, let's talk about the moment on the AP Lang exam where you finally get to stop dissecting other people's writing and do some writing of your own, and not just any writing, but storytelling. FRQ3, the prose, construal, or narrative task, is your opportunity to demonstrate that you don't just understand how rhetoric works in the abstract. You can actually wield it. Think of it this way. The first two FRQs ask you to be a critic and an architect of argument. This one asks you to be a novelist, even if just for 25 minutes. What the task actually asks you to do, here's what College Board is really asking. They will give you a short prompt, sometimes a single sentence, sometimes a brief paragraph, sometimes an image or an excerpt, and they want you to write a narrative that responds to it. The technical term College Board uses is prose construal, which sounds intimidating until you realize it just means constructing meaning through prose. You're not summarizing, you're not arguing. You're telling a story, and that story should demonstrate your mastery of narrative craft, the same craft you've been analyzing in other people's essays and literary passages all semester. The prompt will often include language like write a narrative that illustrates, or write a story that explores, or reflect on an experience that demonstrates. Pay close attention to that verb. If it says illustrate, your story needs to make a concept or idea vivid and concrete. If it says explore, you have a little more interpretive latitude. Whatever the phrasing, your job is to respond to the specific creative invitation being extended to you, not to write a generic personal essay you had pre-written in your head. This is one of the most common traps students fall into, arriving with a story they love and forcing it to fit the prompt, like pushing a square peg into a round hole. Readers notice immediately when a narrative doesn't genuinely engage with the task at hand. The scoring rubric and what it rewards. The rubric for FRQ3 is structured around three core dimensions: thesis or controlling idea, evidence and commentary, and sophistication. Let's unpack each one in the context of narrative writing, because they function a little differently here than they do in the argumentative FRQ. Your controlling idea in a narrative is not a thesis statement in the traditional argumentative sense. You're not going to write, in this essay, I will argue instead. Your controlling idea is the insight or meaning your story is building toward. Think of it like the difference between a highway sign and a destination. The argumentative essay plants a sign at the beginning and keeps pointing at it. A narrative invites the reader on a journey, and the destination, the meaning, reveals itself through the accumulation of detail, scene, and voice. College Board still wants that meaning to be present and purposeful, though. A story that goes nowhere earns no points for having a controlling idea. You need to know what your story is about at the thematic level before you write the first sentence. For evidence and commentary in a narrative context, your evidence is the story itself, the specific details, scenes, dialogue, and descriptions you choose to include. Your commentary is the narrative craft at work. The way a carefully chosen detail reveals character, the way pacing speeds up during a moment of crisis, the way a shift in tone signals a change in understanding. College Board's rubric specifically rewards students who use appropriate and relevant details. That word appropriate is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. It means your details should serve the story's meaning, not just decorate the page. Sophistication, the highest tier of each rubric dimension, is where narrative writing can genuinely shine if you're strategic about it. Sophisticated prose in this context means things like an unexpected but perfectly apt structural choice, a narrator whose voice is distinctly rendered and consistent throughout, an ending that recontextualizes what came before, or a central metaphor that carries meaning without being overstated. Think of a story you've read where a single recurring image, a color, a sound, a gesture, accumulates meaning as the pages turn. That's the kind of craft that earns full marks here. The narrative craft toolkit you must deploy. College Board has been explicit that they're looking for evidence of narrative techniques. You should arrive at the exam knowing how to use at least these tools with intention: scene building, showing rather than telling, using sensory detail to put the reader in the moment, dialogue which reveals character and advances action simultaneously, pacing, slowing down for emotionally significant moments, speeding up for transitions. Point of view, first person is most common in personal narratives, but second and third are absolutely options if they serve your story. And reflection, the narrative moment where the narrator steps back and draws meaning from what happened, That last one is crucial and often underdeveloped by students who get so caught up in telling the story that they forget to tell us what it means. A brief moment of explicit reflection, just a sentence or two, can transform a competent story into a purposeful one. Common traps and how to avoid them. The biggest trap, as I mentioned, is bringing a prepackaged story that doesn't fit the prompt. The second biggest trap is writing a vague, generic narrative with no specific details. I learned a lot from this experience, and it changed how I see the world. That kind of writing is invisible. Specificity is everything. A single, concrete, surprising detail tells the reader more than 3 paragraphs of vague reflection. Third trap, neglecting structure. A narrative with no discernible shape, no rising tension, no turning point, no sense of arrival, reads like a summary of events rather than a crafted story. Even in 25 minutes, you need a beginning that establishes stakes, a middle that complicates them, and an ending that resolves or meaningfully refuses to resolve them. Connections to other units. Everything you've studied in Units 1 through 3 about rhetorical strategies, diction, syntax, and structure feeds directly into this task. The difference is that in FRQ3, you are the author being analyzed. When you choose a fragment for emphasis, that's the same technique you circled in someone else's essay during Unit 2. When you build toward an emotional climax using short, punchy sentences, that's the same sentence rhythm work you've been doing all year. Narrative writing is not separate from rhetoric. It is rhetoric, just wearing different clothes. In the next section, we'll zoom out and look at how all 3 FRQs work together as a complete picture of your rhetorical capabilities and how to manage your time strategically across the entire free response section. 4.16 Selecting and Framing a Narrative for Rhetorical Purpose. What it means to choose a story. Imagine you're trying to convince your school board to fund a new arts program. You could cite statistics, participation rates, academic outcomes, budget comparisons. But instead, you open with the story of one student, a kid named Marcus, who found his voice through the school choir after years of struggling in silence. Same argument, completely different impact. That choice to lead with Marcus instead of the spreadsheet is exactly what this section is about. Selecting and framing a narrative for rhetorical purpose means making deliberate, strategic decisions about which story to tell, how to tell it, and why that particular story serves your larger argument better than any other option available to you. On the AP exam, College Board wants you to recognize that skilled writers don't just stumble into their narratives the way you might stumble into a coffee shop because it started raining. They engineer them. Every narrative choice, the opening scene, the perspective, the details included or omitted, the emotional register, is in service of a larger rhetorical goal. Your job, both as a reader analyzing texts and as a writer composing your own, is to see those engineering decisions clearly. Selecting the right narrative, the strategic why. When a writer selects a narrative, they're asking themselves a question that you need to be able to ask too. What story will make my audience believe, feel, or do what I need them to? This is the intersection of logos, ethos, and pathos that runs throughout the entire AP Lang course. A personal anecdote builds ethos and pathos simultaneously. It says, "I have lived this, and here is what it felt like." A historical narrative might carry logos weight because it anchors an argument in documented, verifiable reality. A hypothetical scenario, sometimes called a thought experiment, can make an abstract concept suddenly visceral and immediate. College Board specifically tests whether you can identify why a writer chose a particular type of narrative over other available options. The wrong answer trap on multiple choice questions is almost always picking the answer that describes what the narrative does emotionally without also capturing what it argues. If a passage uses a story about a grandmother's immigration journey to support a claim about resilience in the face of systemic barriers, an answer choice like "to evoke sympathy for the narrator's family" is technically true, but rhetorically incomplete. The better answer will always connect the emotional effect to the argumentative function. Watch for that distinction. It separates student scoring in the 3 range from student scoring 4s and 5s. Framing, the architecture of meaning. Selecting a narrative is only the first half of the equation. Framing is how you present it, and this is where the real craft lives. Think of framing like a photographer choosing where to point the camera. Two photographers standing in the same room can produce completely different images depending on angle, focal length, and what they choose to leave out of the frame. A writer framing a narrative makes analogous choices. Where does the story begin? Where does it end? Whose perspective anchors it? Which details get amplified and which get quietly set aside? The AP exam will ask you to analyze these framing choices in argument passages, personal essays, and journalistic writing alike. Pay particular attention to narrative distance, how close or far the narrator positions themselves from the events being described. A writer who describes a traumatic event in intimate, present-tense detail creates an entirely different rhetorical effect than one who steps back into reflective, past-tense distance. The first pulls the reader into the experience, the second invites them to analyze it. Neither is inherently better. What matters is whether the choice serves the purpose. You also need to understand selective emphasis, which is essentially what gets the camera's focus. A writer arguing that the criminal justice system is broken might tell the story of the same arrest from the perspective of the accused, the arresting officer, the victim, or a bystander. Each framing tells a different story about the same event and therefore makes a different argument. Recognizing which perspective was chosen and theorizing why that perspective serves the writer's claim is a core AP skill. Narrative and the larger argument, how they work together. Here's something that trips up a lot of students. Narrative in argumentative writing is never just decoration. It isn't there to make the piece more interesting the way a garnish makes a plate prettier. The narrative is doing argumentative work. It functions as evidence. This connects directly back to Unit 3's treatment of evidence and reasoning. A narrative is a specific form of evidence, and like all evidence, it requires a warrant, that logical bridge between the story and the claim. When you're writing your own argument on the FRQ and you choose to open with an anecdote, you must make sure the narrative directly supports your thesis. The most common scoring loss on the argument FRQ is when students include a compelling story that never gets connected back to their central claim. The reader finishes the anecdote and thinks, "Lovely, but so what?" Your framing, particularly the commentary you provide around the narrative, is what converts a story into evidence. Show the grader exactly how Marcus's experience in the choir exemplifies your broader claim about the relationship between arts education and student agency. Don't make them guess. Edge cases and exam traps to watch for. One boundary condition that appears regularly in multiple-choice passages is the unreliable narrator situation, when the writer's framing of a narrative seems to undercut or complicate the stated argument. In these cases, College Board is testing whether you notice the tension between what the narrative shows and what the writer claims it proves. A savvy reader sees that gap. An unsavvy reader takes the writer's interpretation at face value. Another common trap involves conflating the narrative's subject with its purpose. A story about poverty is not automatically an argument about poverty. It might actually be an argument about community or resilience or policy failure. Always ask what the narrative is being used to claim, not just what it depicts finally. Remember that framing choices sometimes involve conspicuous omission. What the writer doesn't tell you, the part of the story that gets cut, can be as rhetorically significant as what they do include on both MCQ and FRQ. Demonstrating awareness of omission as a rhetorical strategy signals sophisticated analytical thinking. Connections across the course. This concept threads through nearly every other unit. In Unit 2, you analyze how writers build arguments. Narrative selection is one of the primary methods. In Unit 3, narrative functions as evidence, requiring the same kind of claim evidence reasoning analysis you apply to statistics or expert testimony. In Unit 5, when you encounter synthesis tasks on the exam, you'll often need to identify how multiple sources frame similar narratives differently to advance different agendas. And in your own writing across Units 4 and 5, the ability to select and frame a narrative strategically is what separates a generic 5-paragraph response from the kind of essay that earns top marks. In the next section, we'll look at how writers use specific details and descriptions within those narratives to create vivid, concrete scenes. Because once you've chosen your story and framed it strategically, you still have to make the reader actually see it.